On a cold afternoon in Amsterdam, the sharp clatter of pots and pans echoed through the air outside the United States consulate. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, and defiant. Protesters gathered in small but determined numbers, sending a message they hoped would travel far beyond the Netherlands. Their demand was clear: Greenland is not for sale, and Europe must stop remaining silent. Banners waved above the crowd, many marked with bold red lines crossing out images of U.S. President Donald Trump. Others carried handwritten letters addressed directly to the people of Nuuk, Greenland's capital, warning of what demonstrators described as a dangerous new form of imperial ambition. To them, the issue was no longer symbolic or theoretical. They believed Greenland had become the latest target in a growing pattern of economic and political coercion. At the center of the protest was a shared belief that military gestures would not be enough to deter Washington. The recent deployment of NATO reconnaissance teams and small contingents of soldiers to Greenland under Denmark's Arctic Endurance Initiative was viewed by activists as largely symbolic. A few dozen troops, they argued, would not change Trump's calculations. According to several protesters, the U.S. president responds not to diplomacy or symbolism, but to pressure that directly affects what they see as his greatest vulnerability, the economy. They argued that finance, trade, and tariffs are the only tools capable of forcing a shift in policy. Many in the crowd claimed that the European Union holds far more economic power than it is willing to use. With a larger consumer base and a combined economic output that rivals or surpasses that of the United States, they insisted Europe has the capacity to respond forcefully. Protesters pointed to recent trade agreements signed by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, agreements they say were initially designed to counter aggressive U.S. tariff threats. In their view, Europe must be willing to accept short-term economic discomfort if it means stopping what they describe as coercive tactics. Some acknowledged that retaliatory measures would be painful, but argued they would ultimately hurt the United States more than the EU. Only then, they claimed, would Trump be forced to reconsider a strategy that they believe is isolating Washington and creating new enemies. Beyond economics, the language used by protesters was charged with moral urgency. Several described the situation as neocolonialism, accusing the United States of attempting to exert control over a territory without respect for its people, environment, or political autonomy. They argued that Greenland's future should be decided solely by Greenlanders themselves, in cooperation with Denmark, and not influenced by foreign threats or financial punishment. Others drew parallels between Greenland and other global flashpoints. Some accused the U.S. administration of illegal interventions elsewhere, citing Venezuela as an example, and warning that Greenland could become the next stage in what they see as an expansionist agenda. For them, Europe's past silence was part of the problem. They called on the EU to finally take a clear and united stance. Words like fascism, imperialism, and authoritarianism surfaced repeatedly in interviews with demonstrators. While such language reflects activist perspectives rather than official positions, it underscored the intensity of public anger. Many warned that the world is entering a more unstable phase, where economic pressure and territorial ambition are replacing diplomacy. As chants filled the streets of Amsterdam, pressure was simultaneously escalating thousands of kilometers away in Washington. Inside the White House, during what was expected to be a routine event focused on rural healthcare, President Trump introduced a remark that immediately sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. He suggested that tariffs could be used as punishment against allies who refused to support U.S. control over Greenland. Recounting conversations with European leaders, Trump claimed that economic threats had already proven effective in other negotiations. He described imposing tariffs far higher than necessary, framing them as leverage to force compliance. Trump openly stated that he was considering similar measures tied directly to Greenland, arguing that U.S. national security required control of the Arctic island. He suggested that countries unwilling to go along could face economic consequences, reinforcing concerns in Europe that trade policy was being weaponized for geopolitical goals. For months, Trump has insisted that anything less than U.S. control over Greenland is unacceptable. He has repeatedly framed the island as strategically essential, emphasizing its location, natural resources, and importance to Arctic security. His rhetoric has alarmed European leaders, who fear that economic threats could undermine international norms and alliances. Behind the scenes, efforts to cool tensions are ongoing. Earlier in the week, Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers held closed-door meetings with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. While all sides described the talks as constructive, there was little clarity on what had actually been agreed. A joint working group was announced, but interpretations differed sharply. Copenhagen emphasized dialogue and cooperation, while Washington framed the discussions as part of broader strategic planning. The lack of a shared narrative only fueled uncertainty. Publicly, European officials have pushed back more firmly in recent days. EU representatives reiterated that Greenland's status is not open for negotiation and that decisions about its future belong exclusively to Greenland and Denmark. These statements were welcomed by protesters, though many said words alone were no longer enough. Meanwhile, NATO's presence in the Arctic continues to grow. Around 200 Allied personnel are already stationed in Greenland, and Denmark has signaled plans for a larger and more permanent deployment through 2026. Officials describe this as defensive and precautionary, but critics argue it reflects a broader militarization of the region. For activists on the streets, the issue is not just about Greenland, but about the precedent being set. They fear a future where economic pressure replaces international law, and where powerful nations openly threaten allies to achieve territorial or strategic goals. Greenland, they insist, must not become a bargaining chip, a tariff target, or the prize of a new global power struggle. Its people, culture, and environment deserve protection from what they view as external exploitation. As protests continue and diplomatic negotiations quietly unfold, one question looms over Europe and the Arctic alike. Will the European Union draw a clear line and use its economic strength to push back, or will it allow Greenland to become the front line in an increasingly aggressive contest for power? For now, the answer remains uncertain. But from the streets of Amsterdam to the corridors of Washington, the debate is no longer confined to closed rooms. It is loud, public, and increasingly impossible to ignore.